That's right, Edgar is English. I keep forgetting.
And you know
For decades, one stage decided who became a star and who disappeared overnight. Guests walked in chasing fame, but few understood the unwritten rules that came with it. One wrong move, one careless joke, one broken trust, and the door closed forever. No warnings. No second chances. Just silence. Some crossed a line on live television. Others broke a bond built over years. Each thought they were untouchable. Each was wrong. What followed wasn't rage or revenge, it was something colder, erasure. Tonight, we uncover the guests who vanished from the spotlight, the reasons behind their fall, and the price they paid for crossing a line that was never meant to be crossed.
Because he's very good. Would you welcome Rich Little?
He appeared on that stage more than 30 times, turning his voice into a weapon of comedy, slipping effortlessly between presidents, movie stars, and legends of the screen. Audiences couldn't get enough. Every impression landed like a perfectly timed punchline, and for years, he was one of the most requested guests on the biggest couch in television. The host laughed along every single time, genuinely entertained by the sheer skill on display. But what the cameras never captured was what happened the moment the lights went off. Behind the scenes, the impressions never stopped. In the hallway, during rehearsals, even in casual conversation, he stayed locked in character, cycling through voices instead of ever speaking as himself. What felt fresh and thrilling in 5-minute bursts on air became exhausting in real life, hour after hour, day after day. The host began to notice something unsettling. Where was the real person underneath all those voices? Did one even exist anymore? Then came a deeper problem, one far more damaging than habit. The material stopped evolving. Old bits resurfaced with only minor tweaks, jokes recycled instead of reinvented. For a host who prided himself on sharp, ever-changing comedy, this wasn't just disappointing, it was a quiet betrayal of everything the show stood for. Guests were expected to grow, to bring something new every time they walked out. Coasting on yesterday's laughter was unacceptable. So the call simply stopped. No dramatic falling out, no public statement, no explanation offered. When his team reached out to book another appearance, they were met with vague, polite deflections. Scheduling conflicts. A different direction this season. The truth was far simpler and far colder. The decision had already been made, and it was final. For years afterward, he found himself waiting for a call that never came. He didn't understand what had gone wrong, replaying old appearances in his mind, searching for the moment he'd lost his place. It wasn't until much later that the real reason surfaced, quietly, through people who had been in the room. It was never about talent. It was about growth, about staying sharp instead of settling into comfort. His story is a reminder that some endings don't arrive with noise. There's no explosive scandal, no headline, no dramatic confrontation to point to. Just a slow, silent fade, an invitation that never returns, a name quietly removed from the list. In a world obsessed with big, loud downfalls, his disappearance proves something far more unsettling. Sometimes all it takes to lose everything is simply becoming predictable. He arrived like a storm nobody had invited into a room built on calm. Loud, combative, dripping with attitude before he even took his seat, he represented a brand new kind of television, one built on shouting instead of substance, chaos instead of conversation. His own show had already made him a household name, famous for smoke-filled sets, screaming matches, and guests reduced to punching bags. Some found it thrilling. Others found it exhausting. The host who built his career on subtlety and restraint found it something else entirely, a threat to everything his stage represented. When the booking finally happened, there was hesitation in the air. Still, curiosity won out, maybe even a sense of obligation to give this new voice a fair shot. What followed instead was chaos wrapped in charisma. He didn't walk onto that stage, he stormed it, soaking in applause like a rock star before a single word was exchanged. Questions meant for calm answers were interrupted mid-sentence. He spoke over his host entirely, addressing the crowd as though the show belonged to him and him alone. The host sat still through all of it, composed on the surface, but reading every second with growing certainty. This wasn't spontaneity, it was disrespect dressed up as entertainment. And then came the moment that sealed everything. Without warning, he turned his fire toward other hosts in the industry, mocking them by name, accusing them of lacking the courage to speak real truths. The insult wasn't subtle. Everyone in that studio understood exactly who those words were really aimed at. The segment ended the way it always did, with a polite thank you and a practiced smile. But backstage, the mood had already shifted from curiosity to certainty. There would be no second invitation. Ever. What played out on camera wasn't just an awkward interview, it was a preview of a media landscape the host wanted no part of, one where volume replaced wit, and conflict replaced conversation entirely. This wasn't personal anger. It was something closer to grief for an industry beginning to change beneath his feet. He wasn't rejecting a person so much as rejecting a direction, a warning sign of where entertainment was heading. In refusing to open that door again, he drew a quiet line in the sand, a final stand for substance in a world quickly falling in love with noise. Sometimes the loudest downfall isn't the guest who gets banned. It's the moment everyone realizes why.
Didn't you used to be under contract at RKO?
Now you see,
She wasn't just another famous face passing through, she was a two-time Academy Award winner, a performer whose talent had shaped decades of cinema. Her presence carried weight, the kind that came from genuine mastery of craft, not just charm or luck. When she sat down for an interview, audiences leaned in, knowing they were about to hear stories no one else could tell, wild, sprawling tales soaked in old glamour and sharp humor. For years, she was pure gold on that stage. But there was another side to her, one that grew harder to ignore as time went on. Beneath the brilliance sat something unpredictable, a temper that could shift without warning, often stirred by whatever she'd had to drink before walking out. Behind the scenes, the tension was already building. Nobody quite knew which version of her would show up on any given night, the dazzling storyteller or someone else entirely. The night everything unraveled started like any other. She took her seat, drink already in hand, launching into her usual charm. But something felt off almost immediately. Her sentences drifted without direction, thoughts trailing into nowhere, the usual spark noticeably dimmed. The host tried gently to guide things back on track, softening his questions, adjusting his rhythm, doing everything he could to keep the moment from slipping further. Then came a harmless joke, the kind she'd made about herself plenty of times before. Except this time, something inside her snapped without warning. She grabbed her drink and hurled it directly into his face, glass, ice, liquid, all of it. The room froze. Cameras kept rolling a beat too long before cutting away. He sat there drenched and stunned, holding his composure just long enough to signal the break, but the moment cameras stopped, so did any trace of patience. She was escorted out before the show resumed and never returned. There was no second chance, no quiet path back. What had happened wasn't just an outburst, it was a violation of an unspoken agreement every guest was expected to honor: respect for the platform, the audience, and the person extending the invitation. Years later, in a rare moment of honesty, she admitted she'd been in a dark place, that she understood completely why the door never reopened. Sometimes the most talented people fall the hardest, not because the world stopped believing in them, but because they stopped believing in the moment they were given. He wasn't just a comedian, he was a cultural lightning rod, someone who used humor as a weapon against silence itself. Alongside his brother, he built a reputation for fearless commentary, pushing boundaries most performers wouldn't dare approach. His own variety show became a battleground for anti-war sentiment and social critique, drawing both fierce admiration and furious backlash in equal measure. Even those who respected his intelligence and sharp wit couldn't always stomach where he chose to take a conversation. The stage he stepped onto operated by different rules, ones built on relief rather than confrontation. It was meant to be a refuge, a place where people divided by war and shifting culture could sit down together and simply laugh for a while. Politics existed there, but only ever lightly, never allowed to dominate the room. He, however, struggled to separate his comedy from his convictions, and that struggle eventually reached a breaking point neither side could ignore. During one particular appearance, what should have been a light, easy segment took a sharp turn. Without warning, he pivoted the conversation into a pointed, unmistakable critique of the ongoing war, abandoning the unspoken agreement that had always defined that stage. The host's expression barely shifted, practiced calm holding steady on the surface. But something behind his eyes changed instantly, a flicker of tension that longtime crew members recognized immediately. The segment finished professionally, applause and handshakes intact, but the message afterward was unmistakably clear: too much trouble for too little reward. There was no dramatic ban, no public statement, nothing the press could point to. Instead, something quieter happened. When his name came up during future booking discussions, producers simply found reasons to move past it. The invitations slowed, then stopped altogether. To him, it likely felt like censorship, a door closing on ideas that mattered. To the host, it was something else entirely: protection of the show, the audience, and a fragile balance built over years of careful trust. It wasn't rejection of a message, it was rejection of a method that threatened everything that stage was built to offer. In the end, his absence became a quiet symbol of the boundaries that govern that world, a reminder that even fearless voices sometimes get erased not through anger, but through silence.
I want you to know I was at the royal wedding, Charles and Di.
She wasn't just another comedian trying to break into an industry that barely made room for women in the spotlight. She was chosen, handpicked, elevated in a way almost no one else had been. At a time when female performers were treated as novelty acts rather than serious talent, one man decided to change that entirely, handing her the chair again and again until she became the very first permanent guest host that stage had ever known. It wasn't just an opportunity, it was a declaration of trust in front of the entire country. Off camera, the bond ran even deeper. Long dinners, late-night conversations, creative sessions that stretched for hours, a relationship built on mutual respect rather than obligation. He became something close to a father figure, asking for nothing in return, only offering unwavering belief in her talent. That kind of loyalty is rare in an industry built on transactions, which is exactly what made what came next so devastating. An offer arrived that could change everything: her very own late-night program on a brand-new network, airing directly opposite the very show that made her a star. The numbers were staggering, the opportunity undeniable, a chance to finally step out from beneath a very long shadow. But there was one question she never found the courage to answer honestly: how do you tell the man who built your career that you're about to become his rival? She didn't. The news broke publicly before she ever picked up the phone to explain herself. He learned about her decision not through a private conversation, but through a headline, like everyone else. In that instant, something inside him shifted permanently. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no dramatic scene. Just a quiet, devastating sentence uttered before he disappeared behind closed doors. She didn't even call. What followed was total and unshakable. Her presence was scrubbed from archives, her name avoided entirely, as though years of history together had simply been erased overnight. She tried everything to repair it: phone calls, letters, gifts, mutual friends carrying messages back and forth. Every attempt was met with the same wall of silence. Nothing ever came back. The professional fallout was just as brutal. Doors that once opened easily suddenly stayed shut. The industry took its cue from his silence, and her career suffered because of it. But those closest to her knew the deeper wound wasn't professional at all, it was personal, the loss of a friendship she never stopped grieving. Decades later, even in her final years, she would grow emotional discussing what happened, admitting he gave her everything and she'd hurt him in return. Some silences, it turns out, never truly end.
Is in its fifth printing. The
I
first
told
four,
you that this afternoon.
the first four were
He never played by the rules of a typical guest. No polished stories, no rehearsed charm, instead he leaned straight into discomfort, treating every appearance like a performance wrapped inside an interview. From his very first appearances, he crafted a persona that felt awkward, combative, almost irritated, challenging questions instead of answering them, throwing off the entire rhythm of the segment on purpose. At first, it worked brilliantly. The host recognized exactly what he was doing, flipping the usual Hollywood charm act on its head, and found it fascinating. It was risky, unpredictable, and audiences couldn't look away. Was he serious? Was this all an act? That uncertainty became part of the appeal, drawing viewers back appearance after appearance. But with each new visit, the bit pushed further, sharper, colder. What started as clever sparring slowly turned into something more pointed, questioning whether the host truly cared about his guests at all, suggesting the warmth on screen was nothing more than a performance too. It was still framed as comedy, but it carried an edge that felt increasingly personal. Then came the moment that changed everything. During one particular appearance, he mocked the host's delivery outright, hinting through thinly veiled satire that the warmth everyone loved was hollow, manufactured, fake. For a man who had spent decades carefully building an image of genuine warmth, that jab landed somewhere real. Those close enough to notice saw it instantly, a tightening around the eyes, a smile that held just a fraction too long. There was no outburst, no visible anger. The segment finished exactly as planned. But the moment the cameras cut away, a quiet decision had already been made. No official statement followed, no public falling out, just silence. When future appearances were pitched, the answers came back vague and polite. Scheduling conflicts. Not the right timing. Everyone behind the scenes understood exactly what that really meant. Years later, in a rare moment of reflection, he admitted he may have pushed the bit too far, believing he was channeling a kind of chaotic genius that never quite landed the way he intended. But limits existed, even for someone who valued sharp, boundary-pushing comedy. The moment a performance began to undermine trust instead of build tension, it stopped being clever and started being corrosive. Once that trust cracked, it never fully reassembled. His story remains a quiet lesson in exactly where performance ends and something far more personal begins.
The reason that I don't have much use for them is because primarily they are dumb. And
he was never just another author making the rounds for publicity. He was magnetic in a way few writers ever managed to be, sharp-tongued, eccentric, endlessly quotable. The mind behind some of the most celebrated literary work of his generation, he brought a flamboyant brilliance to every appearance, unpredictable in the best possible way. Audiences adored him, not despite his strangeness, but because of it. He was, in many ways, the perfect guest, literate, electric, impossible to look away from. But by the mid-1970s, the sharp edges that once defined his genius had started to dull under a weight far heavier than fame. Alcohol and addiction had begun quietly eroding the man behind the wit, turning playful eccentricity into something far more fragile. When he walked onto that stage for what would become his final appearance, everyone hoped for the version they remembered, the storyteller, the charmer, the electric presence from years before. What arrived instead was someone clearly unwell, unraveling in real time under the studio lights. His words slurred together, sentences lost their shape halfway through, his eyes drifted into empty space between questions. Every attempt to guide him gently through the conversation, shorter questions, patient pauses, extra room to find his footing, failed to bring back any sense of stability. Instead, the conversation drifted somewhere far more troubling, into explicit, rambling stories completely unsuitable for a national broadcast. The decision had to be made quickly. The segment was cut short, ending nearly 6 minutes earlier than planned, a quiet mercy disguised as a scheduling choice. Backstage, in a tone reserved only for genuine concern, he was told plainly that he wasn't well enough to continue that night. He tried to argue, but his own slurred words only proved the point being made. There was no scene, no confrontation, just a quiet ending to what should have been a triumphant return. Afterward came a decision far heavier than anger: he would never be invited back. Not as punishment, but as protection, both for the integrity of the broadcast and for a man clearly in crisis in front of millions of viewers. The cost, however, was steep. That stage had been one of his last major connections to a public audience, and losing it meant losing one of the final threads tying him back to relevance. His career, already faltering, never fully recovered. In the end, it wasn't fury that closed that door, it was sorrow, a heartbreak dressed as a business decision. Sometimes the saddest downfalls aren't the loud, chaotic ones, but the quiet moments when someone watches a person they once admired slowly disappear in real time, and realizes there's nothing left to do but let go.
Tommy Smothers. Now, did you hear what he said about?
Yes, I heard
He
that.
stood beside his brother through some of the most turbulent years in television history, half of a duo that turned comedy into a form of quiet rebellion. Together they built something rare, a stage where sharp wit and cultural commentary lived side by side, pushing boundaries that most performers wouldn't dare approach. Their variety show became a battleground for anti-war sentiment and social critique, drawing both devoted admiration and furious backlash in equal measure. Even those who respected their intelligence couldn't always stomach where their conversations were headed. The stage they stepped onto for that particular appearance ran on very different rules, built around relief instead of confrontation. It existed as a refuge, a place where a divided, exhausted country could sit together for a moment and simply laugh. Politics touched that room only lightly, never allowed to take over. But separating comedy from conviction had never come easily for either brother, and that tension eventually reached its breaking point. During one appearance, what should have unfolded as an easy, light-hearted segment took a sudden, deliberate turn towards something far more pointed, a sharp critique of the war dominating headlines everywhere. The shift wasn't subtle, and it broke an unspoken agreement that had always defined that particular stage. The host's expression barely moved on the surface, practiced composure holding firm, but something behind his eyes shifted instantly, a flicker longtime crew members recognized without needing to be told. The segment ended professionally, handshakes and applause intact, but the message afterward traveled fast and clear: too much risk for too little reward. No dramatic band followed, no headline, nothing the press could seize on. Instead, something quieter took hold. When future bookings were discussed, producers simply found other directions to take, other names to call. The invitations slowed, then stopped entirely. To the brothers, it likely felt like their voice was being silenced, a door closing on ideas that mattered deeply to them. To the host, it was something else, protection of a fragile balance built carefully over years of trust. It wasn't a rejection of their message so much as a rejection of where and how they chose to deliver it. In the end, their absence became a quiet symbol of the invisible boundaries that govern that world, proof that even the boldest voices sometimes fade out not through anger, but through silence. He wasn't just another entertainer chasing a punchline, he was a Vegas icon who had spent years carefully crafting an image built on charm, grace, and pure showmanship. For most of the decade, his name surfaced regularly in the host's opening monologues, usually harmless, centered around his eternally youthful looks and flashy style. Individually, the jokes seemed light enough. But over time, they stacked up, and what once felt playful started to feel like something else entirely, personal. He operated in a world where perception was everything, where a single suggestive joke about his masculinity could quietly chip away at an image built over years of hard work. What the audience saw as harmless ribbing, he experienced as a slow erosion of respect. Eventually, he decided he'd had enough, and instead of a phone call or a carefully worded statement, he chose confrontation, direct, immediate, impossible to ignore. Dressed head to toe in full performance attire, he bypassed studio security entirely, marched straight through the halls, and walked into the host's office completely unannounced. The room went still. What followed wasn't a conversation, it was an ultimatum, delivered standing over the desk without hesitation. Jokes about his music were fair game. Jokes about his hair, fine. But if his sexuality ever became a punchline again, there would be consequences, physical ones. That single threat changed everything instantly. The host, a man rarely rattled by anything, understood immediately that a line had been crossed, one that had nothing to do with comedy and everything to do with respect. He rose slowly, meeting the moment with quiet, unshakable authority, delivering a response that left no room for negotiation: leave now, or be removed by force. No shouting followed. Just finality. The fallout was immediate and absolute. A simple directive went out to the booking staff: that name was never to appear on the list again, not that week, Not that year, not ever. Beyond that single stage, though, he remained wildly beloved, still filling Vegas showrooms night after night. But losing access to that national platform meant losing a direct line into households across the entire country, a connection television alone could offer. Years later, reflecting on that moment without a trace of regret, he stood firmly by his decision, insisting some things were simply worth defending no matter the cost. But for the man on the other side of that desk, the matter had already been settled the moment the threat was made. Respect could be tested, disagreements could be forgiven, but intimidation crossed a line that never reopened, not for anyone, regardless of fame or history.